Hey, so before I start the video, I just want to say a couple things. With my new schedule, at the beginning of each month, I'll release an introductory video to director. Over the course of the month, I'll release smaller videos that go into more detail. Also, I don't speak Polish, so if any of my pronunciations are incorrect, I'm really sorry. Anyways, let's get to the video. Before I delve into the life and works of Krzysztof Kieslowskı, I want to open with a quote that will hopefully illustrate just how great a writer-director Kieslowskı is. This is the foreword written for Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, a book of the screenplays to each episode of Kieslowski's magnum opus, Decalogue. I am always reluctant to single out some particular feature of the work of a major filmmaker because it tends inevitably to simplify and reduce the work. But in this book of screenplays by Krzysztof Kieslowskı and his co-author, Krzysztof Kieslowskı, it should not be out of place to observe that they have the very rare ability to dramatize their ideas rather than just talking about them. By making their points through the dramatic action of the story, they gain the added power of allowing the audience to discover what's really going on rather than being told. They do this with such dazzling skill you never see the ideas coming and don't realize until much later how profoundly they have reached your heart. The author of this foreword, Stanley Kubrick, the director Christopher Nolan named as the best director of all time, looked up to Kieslowskı. Kieslowskı was born on June 27, 1941 in Warsaw, Poland, right in the middle of Nazi occupation. If you know anything about the history of the USSR, you would know that the Nazi occupation would give way to Soviet occupation after the events of World War II. Kieslowski's childhood was one without roots, as his father suffered from tuberculosis, and so young Kieslowskı would follow his father around to different hospitals and sanatoria. In 1962, he graduated the Warsaw College for Theater Technicians, but it would take him 3 tries to be accepted into the Lodz Film School, completing his studies there in 1968. As an interesting side note, later on in the 70s, Kieslowskı would come to represent the antithesis of the teachings of the Lodz School, as they favored traditional shooting, while Kieslowskı embraced a more free-flowing documentary style. After graduating, Kieslowskı began his career as a documentary filmmaker. He directed several documentary shorts, usually focusing on everyday Poles, bricklayers, pedestrians, funeral goers, etc. Kieslowskı stated his influence from the American documentary movement of direct cinema, and his documentary style reflected this influence, where the film is about the subject purely, and not the documentarian. A good American comparison would be the Maysles brothers, with their films Salesman, Gimme Shelter, and Great Gardens, among others. Kieslowskı made the films within the system, working for the documentary film studio, and so his films were subject to heavy censorship. There's also the fact that he was making the films in the Soviet Union. Kieslowskı would go on to talk about how the censorship helped him grow as an artist, but that's going to be covered in the next video. By the time of his first theatrical feature, Kieslowskı already had a multitude of both fiction and documentary shorts under his belt, not to mention an hour-long TV movie. However, Blizna, known in English as The Scar, would see Kieslowskı stepping into the role for which he's most well known, that being a theatrical filmmaker. The Scar, by no means Kieslowski's best work, but a fine work nonetheless, features the incorporation of the two worlds in which he operated, the world of fiction film and the world of documentaries. The story is pretty simple. After some suits strike a shady deal to build a chemical plant in a Polish village which opposes the plant, the party hires Stefan Bednarz as director of the plant. He's an honest man who wants to improve relations with the town, caring almost too much for its residents, but the party has him on a leash. The party undercuts any goodwill he might accrue, leading him to frustration and domestic troubles. Within the film, a small team of documentary filmmakers follow Bednarz as the subject of their own film, their honest portrayal of Bednarz in the factory deeply troubling the party. Obviously, an insertion of Kieslowskı into the film. Kieslowskı wouldn't retire from documentaries, but for the purposes of the video, from now on, we're just going to cover the feature films and Decalogue. His next feature film, Amateur, translated into English to the title of Camera Buff, is when I personally believe Kieslowskı became a great director. The film follows a white-collar factory worker who buys an 8mm movie camera to film his new daughter's childhood. The factory director hears that he owns a movie camera and so hires him to film events at the factory. Before he knows it, he's attending film festivals and he becomes obsessed with filmmaking. The film, which obviously draws from Kieślowski's life to a large degree, follows the birth and growth of an artist in Poland. So then, the 80s came around, a time of great public and political strife in Poland, and all the world for that matter, as the Cold War was coming to an end. Kieślowski made his third film, Blind Chance, in 1981, during the period of Solidarity. Solidarity, for anyone who doesn't know, was an independent labor union led by Lech Walesa. It partnered with the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II being Polish himself, and led an anti-Soviet Union social movement throughout all of Poland. However, the era of Solidarity was short-lived, lasting only from August 31st, 1980 to December 13th, 1981, when General Jaruzelski declared martial law on Poland. Martial law would last until 1983, with general amnesty for political prisoners declared in 1986. So how did this all affect Kieślowski? Well, martial law brought with it heavy censorship, and films not approved under martial law were taken out of theaters and confiscated. One of these films was Kieślowski's Blind Chance. The film, although made in 1981, wouldn't release until 1987. What's interesting is that the film is both political and apolitical, showing how one life event can drastically alter the life events of a person. Depending upon what happens to him at the train station, the protagonist either becomes a prominent party member, a Catholic member of the resistance, or he remains apolitical. Critics from both sides of the political spectrum accused him of being on the opposing side, and many people saw the film as merely a time capsule of Solidarity-era Poland, as its delayed release hindered its political relevance. Solidarity and martial law would also play a major role in his 1985 film No End, a ghost story in which a grieving widow copes with her husband's recent death. Her husband, an idealistic yet talented lawyer, leaves behind an unfinished case, the defense of a jailed union member. She calls upon her husband's old mentor to take on the case while she tries to help the client's wife and family. Throughout the film, her husband haunts her, but in subtle ways that no one really notices except for her, driving her to want or need to wipe him from her memory if she wants to continue living. Although it is arguably his most political film, the politics, again, is used more as a backdrop, illustrating the hardships of love divided by borders, whether the division is between life and death or between freedom and imprisonment. Coming into the late 80s, we arrive at what many consider Kieślowski's crowning achievement, Decalogue, a 10-episode series with each episode centered around one or more of the 10 Commandments. Written with frequent co-collaborator Krzysztof Kieslowskı, the series rejects the classic structure of television and instead acts as a collection of standalone films all set in or around an apartment building in Poland. Two of the episodes, episodes 5 and 6, were released as full theatrical films titled A Short Film About Killing and A Short Film About Love, respectively, in a way to recoup some of the costs of filming the series. Initially, Kieślowski intended to write the series with Kieslowskı but allow younger directors to direct each episode of the show. Naturally, he grew attached to the project and directed all of the episodes himself, although almost every episode used a different cinematographer. In fact, due to the show's low budget, Kieślowski would often have to shoot scenes from different episodes on the same day, meaning that he'd work with more than one cinematographer on the same set on the same day. Decalogue is now widely considered one of the best TV shows of all time. It wouldn't be until his next project, though, The Double Life of Veronique, that Kieślowski would break into the Western market. The film's story focuses on Veronica and Veronique, identical women living parallel lives in Poland and France. Miramax distributed the film in the USA, and the film was nominated for the Best Foreign Film Golden Globe, although it lost to Europa. Nevertheless, with this film, Kieślowski cemented himself as a serious filmmaker in the Western world. Finally, we arrive at Kieślowski's final crowning achievement, and his final project before his untimely death in 1996, the Three Colors trilogy. A novel idea, a trilogy based on the meanings of the three colors of the French flag: blue, liberté; white, égalité; and red, fraternité. Blue is described as an anti-tragedy, white an anti-comedy, and red an anti-romance, although I personally find those descriptions reductionist. Each film uses a different cast and, like Decalogue, a different cinematographer. However, the films all connect in subtle ways, also much like the episodes of Decalogue. They all released in quick succession of one another from 1993 to 1994, with Red emerging as the most acclaimed, garnering a Palme d'Or nomination as well as 3 Oscar noms. Three Colors Red has a Metacritic score of 100, a rare feat indeed. After the release of Red in 1994, Kieslowski announced his retirement from filmmaking. On March 13, 1996, he died from a cardiac arrest at the age of 54. Although he left an outstanding legacy in the form of his movies, Kieslowski was also a prolific film teacher. Thankfully, many of his masterclasses, interviews, and cinema classes still exist on video so that his vision of cinema may be passed on to us and future generations.
Ludzie nie są i nie chcą być sobie nawzajem równi, ponieważ tematem tego filmu gdzieś tam w tle, w backgroundzie jest równość. Bohater od razu nie jest równy, ponieważ w pierwszej scenie zachwyca go coś, co wzlatuje w powietrze, co trzepocze, co ma piękny ruch i nagle się okazuje, to, co go zachwyca, go krzywdzi. Wobec tego natychmiast jest poniżony nie tylko przez to, że go mu nasrał na ramię, ale także i przez to, że zawiodła go jego intuicyjna naiwność w stosunku do natury. Gołąb jest oczywiście jakimś tam kawałeczkiem natury, nawet jeżeli to jest w mieście.
So now we move on to the director's trademarks. Like any auteur, Kieślowski's films all bear his signature style, although his style isn't as noticeable as many other directors. For example, in a Wes Anderson film, it's easy to know it's a Wes Anderson film based on the composition, color palette, and set design. Kieślowski's style, on the other hand, isn't as readily apparent, but that doesn't mean it's not there. In terms of visual style, Kieślowski likes to incorporate shots of characters through windows and curtains, no doubt stemming from his background in documentary filmmaking. Kieślowski also likes to make use of mirrors and reflections in general. If I were to point to one thing though, one kind of shot when I think of a Kieślowski film, it would be a shot of a human face. Kieślowski loved the faces of his actors, and his use of close-ups really drove home the emotional arcs of his films. Kieślowski never stuck to one lens. He'd often shoot a scene with a variety of lenses so that he had as much material as he could in post-production. While editing, Kieślowski was known for not just making one cut of his films, but several. Kieślowski also liked to connect his films, whether using characters from previous episodes or movies in later films, as is the case often in Decalogue and in the Three Colors trilogy, or connecting his films with similar scenarios. In the Three Colors trilogy, each protagonist witnesses an old woman trying to put a glass bottle into a recycling can. They each react differently to the situation, depending upon the theme of the film. Also, for some reason, Kieślowski really loved to incorporate milk bottles into his films. Kieślowski worked with the same actors on many projects, which is common for most directors. Some of his regulars are Artur Barkis, Jerzy Stur, Zbigniew Zamakowski, Helen Jacob, and Alexander Bardini. Fun fact, Jerzy Stur plays as a character named Yurik in both The Scar and Three Colors White, leading me to believe that they are possibly the same character, but that's just my own personal fan theory. It hasn't been confirmed or denied. From a thematic perspective, Kieślowski's films deal heavily with ideas of fate, consequence, chance, and free will. His treatment of these concepts come from a place of deep spirituality. For example, his character Young Man in Decalogue, played by Artur Barkis, is often described as either the embodiment of God or the angel of fate by critics. Kieślowski himself refused to say who the character really was. He instead said that it's up to the viewer. there's no doubt that the character's ubiquitous and solemn nature grants him an otherworldly presence. And he interacts with characters during major decisions in the stories. Kieslowskı also refrained from making his films political. Sometimes politics would play a factor in his films, but never did they play as the main focus. In his own words, "When we talk about politics, we immediately start separating ourselves. I found it necessary to look for things which bring people together." He disliked the stereotype of the political Pole and sought to portray his characters, who were often Poles, as just being regular people who happen to have lived in Poland and spoken Polish. The decision is one of the major reasons why his films have such lasting power. They transcend the political and social turmoil in which they were born.
Za tym, co nazywamy motywem politycznym, stoi cała polska historiozofia. To znaczy wszystko to, co się wiąże z kompleksami, a także i z poczuciem dumy Polaka, o tym też już mówiliśmy, prawda? Wszystko to się w jakimś stopniu odbija i odzwierciedla także w dzisiejszej polityce.
And that is the basic overview of Krzysztof Kieslowskı. Thank you for watching my video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I hope that with my new structure that I can start some discussions here on YouTube and maybe introduce you to some of my favorite directors and films. I have links to my resources as well as to where you can find his films in the description.